Hello everyone and welcome to another video here on my channel. Today we are talking about segment.com. Now for those who may be new, my name is Ruben Ugarte. I help companies with data and their tools in particular. I've been doing it now for almost 10 years, maybe a little bit more than 10 years. And segment.com is one of my favorite tools in this space, what has become the customer data platform space. Segment.com was one of the original pioneers in this space. They sort of built it out. And when you think about CDPs, the acronym for it, typically people are talking about segment.com. Now, Segment was acquired by Twilio a few years ago maybe. And from there, the product has really stayed quite good. There's been some things added to it from the Twilio platform. It's been an overall good acquisition. Segment grew like crazy from when it launched. It just hit this particular pain point, which we'll see today, and it just delivered on that pain point incredibly well. And the tool itself is just very reliable, very easy to use, especially once you know a few things around how the data gets ingested. So in this video, I want to give you an overview of Segment, just so you understand what it does. Sometimes people get confused between, what does Segment do compared to a Mixpanel or Amplitude. Give you some guidance there. We'll look at pricing, of course, at least the initial pricing for you to understand how Segment tends to charge for it. And I'll give you some of the maybe more behind the scenes pricing for the advanced things. And then we'll look at a tracking plan. This is a very strong prerequisite before you implement Segment. There's some exceptions now to the use of a tracking plan, but generally it's a helpful step to go through it. We're gonna look at some SDKs, of course, how does Segment actually ingest data, and talk a little bit about the client versus the backend. Then we'll jump into the product, look at some implementation best practices, and give you an overview of the core of it. Typically what Segment today calls the connections product is what we're gonna look at for the most part. Some of the more advanced things, which are from behind the more enterprise, higher level pay plans, we're not going to look at as much. But the core product, typically what brings people to Segment, that's what we're going to really focus on. So with all that being said, we can jump in. There's chapters in this video, so if you want to skip to a specific part, feel free to do that. Let's get started. So as always, in many of my videos here on the channel, I like to share my screen. I think it's a great way to see it. This is the Segment homepage, what we might call today Twilio Segment. I've always referred to the tool as segment.com. I find it a little easier compared to just Segment. Segment is a very popular word in the marketing and data space. You segment user and so on. So segment.com tends to be my go-to. It used to be segment.io when it first started. Today, of course, it should be Twilio Segment. But Segment, the core thing they set out to solve 10 years ago whenever the company started is how do you deal with the ever-increasing number of data destinations? So let's say you have a mobile app on iOS and Android. There's going to be certain actions you want to track. You want to track when users open the app, when they start the onboarding, when they create an account, when they become subscribers or they make some kind of purchase, when they engage with the app. Let's say they fire your key events, right? So if your app is, let's say, a meditation app like Headspace, you want to track when users start the meditation, when they end the meditation, how long they meditate for, and so on. So you're going to have 10, 15, maybe 20 events, 20 actions for this specific app across iOS and Android. So you can track that using the client SDKs, for example, right, on iOS and Android. But then you want to likely send this data to multiple places. You might want to send it to Facebook ads and Google ads if you run paid campaigns. You might want to send it to a Mixpanel or Amplitude if you want to do product analytics, maybe Google Analytics if you use that as well. You might have some mobile attribution like AppsFlyer or Coachella or Branch. You might have data warehouses and so forth, right? Right there we have 5 or 6. It's common to see companies that might have 10, 15, 20 destinations. So if you implement this for every single one individually, you're sort of duplicating the work 5, 6, 7, 8 times. So this is what Segment solved. It said, hey, we're going to give you one API, the segment.com API. You're going to implement to that API once, and then we'll translate it for you. So in the dashboard, which we'll see in a second, you can then add as many destinations as you want, and we'll do all the translation for you behind the scenes. You can remove destinations, you can add them again, doesn't matter. Your implementation only happens once. This is the core premise of segment.com from when it started. Today it has way more things. You can see there's AI, there's profiles, but that was sort of the core idea, the core premise. It's still really built on a lot of this core premise. In the customer data platform, the space that, again, they help really build strongly is the idea that you have a central place to manage all your customer data. And from that central place, you're going to send it to wherever it needs to go. And in that central place, you're going to do any kind of logic or tweaking to make sure the data makes sense, to make sure that it's clean, it's been organized, it's been unified. So if you have multiple apps, let's say you have a web app, iOS, Android, and backend data, you're going to unify all of it under a single profile before you send it to Facebook ads, Google ads, or Mixpanel, or so on. And of course, what made Segment really popular back then is just the integrations. They built a lot of integrations to the tool. They must have, 300 plus integrations. I think the last number I saw was somewhere around 250. And you'll recognize anything here is very likely to be here, right? You're going to have Mixpanel in different ways. You're going to have Amplitude. You're going to have, let's say, the Google products, right? Google Ads, Google Analytics. I think there was Google Sheets I saw as a source. Braze, right? MailChimp, and so on. So over time, they have built a very extensive library of integrations across all the kind of categories that typically you will find in a company today, especially a technology company. They tend to gear or be well suited to go after marketing teams, product teams, which tend to have lots of tools in their stack. This is true 10 years ago. It's even more true today, right? There's typically not single tools that do everything for you. You need 3, 4, 5 different tools to play a role, but you likely know that. So this is what Segment built many years ago, and over time has been just adding new things. And they actually have this repository of new tools that get upvoted by customers, and that's what then allows them to add new destinations. On the sources, they of course also built a lot of sources, and we're not talking about just the classic SDKs. For example, a JavaScript SDK or a backend SDK. They built ability to pull data from specific tools. So for example, here's Mixpanel. So you can send data to Mixpanel, you can send events and profiles, but you can also pull cohorts from Mixpanel, and then those cohorts can then be sent to other destinations. You can see Facebook ads data can be pulled here and then typically sent to like a data warehouse, and then many other sources. So now you start to build this ecosystem where Mixpanel, for example, let's say as a product analytics tool, is not only just receiving data from Segment, it's actually able to send data back into Segment, which then flows into other destinations, non-Mixpanel destinations. A very common example I see here is, for example, mobile attribution, like an AppsFlyer or a Coachella or Branch. It will receive data from Segment. It will then do the attribution itself, and then it can send data back into Segment, so then that mobile attribution data can then flow into Mixpanel, Google Analytics, Facebook ads, and so forth. Now, making all this work requires tweaks and little details for every destination, every source. There's a documentation for every single tool that one has to go through and read in detail to get it work. But generally, it tends to work pretty well. There's a lot of behind-the-scenes magic that Segment does for you, and a lot of the lift in that. If you were to do this yourself, if you were to somehow want to integrate AppsFlyer and Mixpanel together, or maybe something more complex, it will be much more difficult. Now, if you look at the other products, over time they have added other things. So protocols is effectively data governance. So it can help you rename events, block certain events or properties from flowing in or flowing downstream to destinations. It basically becomes a central place for you to manage the quality of your data. Unify is a way for Segment to build audiences. Some of the stuff can happen in other places. So I've done some of the work that Unify does in tools like Mixpanel or Amplitude. But again, if you were to have the Unify add-on, you're doing everything within the Segment universe before it flows out. So you once again sort of reinforce the idea that your customer data platform, segment.com, is where everything happens. All the logic, all the unification, all the creation of audiences, it's all happening here and then flowing from there. And then, of course, with the Twilio acquisition, there's now some engagement tools that Twilio brought on. I believe this is SMS and email that you can then engage users. Something else that's kind of cool that's at least in the last few years is actually reverse ETLs. Reverse ETLs allows you to pull data from your warehouse. So for example, you may have existing data in your warehouse, multiple tables or views, and you can connect this as a source in Segment and then pull it from the warehouse and then send it to destinations. This can work very well, especially if the data in your warehouse is extensive. And you'll see in the tracking plan, this may be one of the exceptions to creating a tracking plan, but you have to make sure the warehouse itself has the data, which not every company does. But nonetheless, it is a cool way to say you already have this data somewhere. Let's simply pull it from there instead of manually implementing some kind of backend SDK, some kind of web SDK. That's the basic premise. We'll see the product here in a second. Just want to cover the pricing. So you can see that the core product, the core promise that Segment was built upon is called Connections. And there's pricing plans for there that you can grow with. And then some of the more advanced things, which is pretty much anything else, the protocols, the data governance that we just saw briefly, the Unify, the Engage, those tend to be behind CDP plans. So if you look at the Connections pricing, this is pretty standard pricing. I actually don't think it has changed in several years, where you have a free plan to basically just test the tool, kind of play around with it, very small amount of visitors per month. Then you have a team plan that gauges based on numbers of visitors. Typically, 10,000 visitors is the included amount. And then there's an amount for every 1,000 visitors on top of that. And then there's a business plan, which other things. Now, one thing to know here is Segment charges based on MTUs, monthly track users. There's really two primary ways that companies charge in this space. One is MTUs, and the other is events. There's a couple of videos on my channel for both Mixpanel and Amplitude. Mixpanel charges based on events these days, and Amplitude charges based on MTUs as well. Tools have changed over and over again on what they charge. I think Mixpanel used to charge for MTUs, now it's events, and Amplitude was vice versa. So they're all kind of making different differences. Segment has been historically consistent. They have always charged by MTUs for as long as I can remember. Pros and cons to each approach. MTUs tend to be really good for B2B products because you have a lower amount of users, either anonymous users, people who are coming to your website who don't have an account, or actual users. You might have like a bookkeeping app and your customers are small businesses. You're probably going to have a small number of that. Relative to consumer apps, which tend to have a large number of users and a low value for them. So if you have like a fitness product, the fitness app may have lots of users, definitely much more than B2B, and the value for those users is lower, and they may also have a larger number of anonymous users because they may be running paid ads and things like that, right? Think of like an e-commerce store where you have a very small conversion rate in total for customers, but you have a very large amount of users. So MTUs tends to be not as ideal for consumer products, high user, low value products. On the other hand, event counts tend to be a little better for those products. But nonetheless, there's always ways they can be tweaked in a range. You can decide to only track a segment of users. For example, I work with products where we only track known users. So users who have an account, who have signed up or logged in, and we don't track the anonymous data. There's downsides to that, but it's an option. So that's MTUs. Now let's see what else I want to mention here. On the business plan, there's a couple things that are kind of interesting. Replaying data is one thing that always comes to mind. Segment allows you to replay data. So you can imagine you set up Segment, you set up Mixpanel, and a year later you decide to switch to Amplitude. There's a feature that you can then replay that year worth of data into Amplitude. So Amplitude doesn't start from scratch. It can take the historical 1 year data and start with that. So it tends to be a very handy thing in some situations, which are typically only at the business level. So we won't go too much into detail on the pricing, just to understand that there's lots of things in the Connections plan, and generally the team plan is where many companies start, and then you build up to it depending on your MTU count. And then once you get to business, of course, you're in custom plans. Typically, when I have clients that go into custom plans, they are starting somewhere around the $20,000-$30,000 a year. Obviously, highly depends on what you're looking for, what the quote might look like. But I always tell companies, you can try it, you can slowly build up to it, and over the next 3, 6, 12 months, you can then decide if you want to upgrade and get other features and slowly get more familiar with it. Now, jump into the CDP plans, just so you know. I mean, this is all custom pricing, so there's not much we can see here. We're also not going to see this too much detail. These are really the advanced Segment features, typically geared towards larger companies that may need it. I find the core product itself is just fantastic. My stance with Segment, whenever companies ask me about this, typically, does it make sense to use Segment? I almost always say yes, with one caveat, which is pricing. The challenge with pricing with Segment is that you're paying to move data from one place to another, almost like an ETL, but much more advanced. And this is fantastic. But for some companies, their data budget is not large enough. So they are thinking, how do we spend our budget to make sure we get insights and we have tools to visualize and create dashboards? And Segment doesn't really let you do that. It's not built for that. So if a company is debating between paying for Mixpanel, paying for Amplitude, paying for AppsFlyer, and paying for Segment, sometimes Segment can fall through the cracks. But besides pricing, I find this is just a fantastic tool. There's very few downsides to it. You might have some specific situations you may have to consider, especially if you have specific privacy requirements, if you're in Europe and so on. But generally, it's just a fantastic tool. And pricing tends to be the major blocker for companies, just to make sure that if you have to pay Segment, let's say $20,000 a year, can you fit that in your budget, knowing that this is not where dashboards and reports are typically built. It's a huge component to making sure data is accurate downstream and helping you save engineering time in particular. But nonetheless, that, in my experience, has been the biggest blocker for companies who want to consider Segment. So let's move on into the tracking plan. So this is a simple document. You can do this in Google Sheets, Google Docs, on paper, a whiteboard, I guess you can do it. And the goal here is just simply to make a note of all the events that you are tracking in your app, that you can track in your app, and then just have some consistency among them. So for example, here's an e-commerce store based on this company called Indochino, this suit tailoring company. And if we look at an e-commerce site, we're gonna see very classic events here. You can click on products, you can add products to the cart, you can view the cart, you start the checkout, then you have some kind of order completed and so on. So there's gonna be 20 events here for this site. You might have something similar for your product, 20, 30 events. Under each event, we can then list event properties that tell us more about the specific action. So in this case, for the order completed, we can know, what was the revenue, what was the tax, what was the discount, and then we may pass some user traits or user profile properties. Segment actually calls them traits. This document in front of us is actually built for Segment. And the value of doing this on a Google Sheet and Excel before you ever write code is you can tweak things. It's very easy to go through one pass, make a note of everything, and then start to condense. Maybe you remove some events, maybe you rename them. The goal is you really want to make everything logical. This is an e-commerce site. If you were not familiar with the site and you saw this data, knowing that it's an e-commerce product, you would probably kind of figure out what events sort of mean. Checkout started means exactly what you might imagine, order completed, and so on. So your events, your event properties, your user traits, they should be very obvious to anyone who's familiar with your product. And doing it in the Google Sheets allows you to make those easy tweaks, easy renaming, easy additions. So when I go through this, I'm going to put this link in the description, this Google Sheets. You can make a copy on your own, no paywall, no email needed. And just really think about going through this if you haven't. This is sort of the building blocks that then make the analysis easier. From Segment's perspective, you can send whatever you want. So it may not seem like that big of a deal, but when you get the data into somewhere where it can be analyzed, like a Mixpanel or Amplitude, it makes a huge deal. So the more work you spend here to make the data logical, the easier it will be to use the data down the line. The other thing you can do is, for Segment to work, they typically have specific requirements for how things should be named. So for example, order completed is actually a special event in the Segment universe. It means this is some kind of purchase of some kind. So when you send this event, Segment knows that this is going to be a purchase. And then inside the event, it's going to look for specific things, such as revenue. So once it sees order completed as an event name and it sees revenue as an event property, it can then translate this into the corresponding purchase events and tools. So for example, for Facebook, it can take this event and it will rename it as the purchase standard event for Facebook ads. And it will take revenue as the value property in Facebook ads. Now, this may seem like a lot. It may seem like a lot of little details. What you need to know is just understand what are the special events, like order completed, like revenue as an event property, and then just use them as much as possible. So you can look at documentation and you'll see that in the different SDKs we're going to see here in a second, and just make a note of that. So same thing, if your initial plan, was called purchase, for example, and then you discover that there's a special Segment event called order completed, you should definitely rename it, right, to match it. You can see that this event actually has a past tense. I don't think there's an ideal whether you use past tense or present tense or any ideal naming convention, as long as you're consistent. So in this case, since segment is looking for this order completed, it sort of makes sense that we're gonna make all the events past tense to match that, and we're gonna make them all title case to match it as well. And same with the event properties. We're gonna make it everything. Segment uses camel case typically, so we'll use like first name right here. So we'll use something like segment typically uses camel case. So in that case, we can make camel case our naming convention for properties. Again, this is not better or worse than lowercase or underscores or anything else, but since segment uses that for its sort of default special reserve properties or special reserve event names, let's use it and let's match our entire plan to that. All right, so this is the tracking plan. So very helpful, really, really valuable to spend time here before you ever write any code, before you ever give this to a developer. And typically once you're done, you're not gonna implement every single event here. Of your 20, 30 events, you might only implement 10, 15 to start. So you give them a priority, you give this to your developer with the documentation links we're going to see in a second, and then they can go ahead and start to implement this in the best way possible. All right, so let's look at the documentation a little bit. The implementation for segment is very similar to like a Mixpanel or Amplitude, if you've ever seen that. The documentation here of segment tends to be very, very good, very extensive. With lots of examples. We can see there's different types of sources for how you ingest data, event streams, which we're going to focus primarily, cloud apps, which is what we saw earlier when we saw, you can pull data from Facebook ads, you can pull data from Mixpanel cohorts, and then reverse ETL, which we also talked about a little bit. Technically, the bulk of the work, if there is going to be any kind of work, will be under the event streams. And in here, we're going to have the standard SDKs you might expect. There'll be stuff for iOS, client side. There'll be stuff for server, Ruby and Java, and there's going to be the web ones. There's the website libraries, the JavaScript one. So let's see if we can open this one. Great. So this is a JavaScript web library. This is the standard library. It's not necessarily the best, especially today, but it is the standard. This is how segment actually started way back then. One note about client versus backend. Generally, in 2024, the recommendation is you want to implement as much as possible in the backend. 80% backend, 20% client if possible. However, pragmatically speaking, for most companies, it tends to be easier to go to the client than the backend. They may have more client developers, iOS, Android developers, front-end developers than backend developers. So there might be a question of just resources and capability. So in your case, you might start with, let's say, 60% front-end, 40% back-end, and over time, you migrate things to the back-end. This is something I'm doing right now with this fitness company. We started with a front-end tracking for their checkout, and that was great for about 6 months. And now we're sort of in the process of upgrading all those events with back-end equivalents, and we're probably going to sunset the front-end tracking. Client front-end tracking is, of course, susceptible to ad blockers, data privacy limitations on iOS. There's lots of issues, which are just going to continue. Back-end tracking has fewer issues. That being said, if we look at the Analytics.js library, there's a few things I want to note. So generally in Segment, you have a few standard tracking methods. The first one is the track. This is how you track events, right? So if you see, here's the event name, then we can pass properties. Actually, here's an example. Here's the event name called article completed, and then the properties we saw in the tracking plan, they go here. You can have integers, numbers, booleans, lists, things like that. Then you have identify, which is where you're identifying specific users, known users. So you're gonna pass some kind of user ID from your own database. You're gonna then pass traits. We saw those like first name, last name, email, and there's a few special options. The web one also has special methods, functions like track link and so on, or track form if you want to use them. There's a page. Page is typically used for page views. So you can pass specific things like the name of the page, or you can just pass a standard page call with just a few properties like the URL and path and so on. Group tends to be a way to group data. So you can imagine a B2B product. The clients are companies, and under each company you have multiple users. So you can group those multiple users under a bigger group, aka a company. And then so on. It's a few other things. This just goes into the sort of details around the JavaScript implementation. But those are the core methods. And then down here, when I talk about the small details, this is where you want to sort of read through it and understand. For example, there's some video player support. So if you have YouTube videos, Vimeo videos, you may not need to do anything. If you have a subdomain, just to make sure this works. And if you have cross-domain, not subdomain, but cross-domain, there's some specific rules as well. UTM tracking and making sure this is set up. And there's the app blockers and a couple other more special things. So this is the library, and then under each implementation, you're going to have specific rules that you have to understand under each destination. So let's see if we can find something like Mixpanel, for example, something like this, and we'll see what this actions means in a second. So when you look at any specific destination, you then sort of have to read through the page to understand how you get started, of course, but what are some of the caveats, the FYIs you should know. What are some of the available actions you can do, right? Here's the same sort of track, identify calls we saw before. Troubleshooting is very, very helpful. Just understanding why some things may not be working for some reason. So every destination has this. So over time, as you implement things, you're just going to become more familiar with the little details for each destination and what makes them tick. And you can see there's a single page for each one. So there's a lot of documentation here for each destination, for all the sources. So typically, you're not going to be lost per se, but there is a lot to ingest to understand how to make Segment work as best as possible. Now, the final note I want to make here, just as an implementation best practices, is your goal is to have a single profile with all the data and traits in one place. Now, Segment itself doesn't actually show this to you as easily. So you might need an external tool like a Mixpanel, like an Amplitude, to be able to see that. Maybe a Brace can work. But generally, if you're familiar with those tools, they have sort of profile functionality. You want to be able to open the profile for John Smith and then see all the traits for John Smith, the first name, the last name, the email, and see all the events that John Smith has fired across all the devices, iOS, Android, web, whatever you have. And it all has to appear in one profile with the right time and event properties and so on. That is success when it comes to implementation. So Segment can show you a little bit of this. We'll see this, but generally you need some kind of tool that can show you this in more detail. So generally, even if you were not going to use a Mixpanel or Amplitude, it's probably helpful just to have it, just to help you with the debugging and make that debugging a little easier. So let's jump into the product itself. We did a lot of prerequisites. This is always really helpful. You have to understand what the product is, the pricing, the tracking plan, the SDKs. Once you go through all that, then we can actually start to look at the product. And you see that the Segment product is actually generally pretty straightforward. There's not a lot in the product itself, just because a lot of the work happens at the implementation level. And if you do a lot of the things properly, like naming things with the right events, names, right, like order completed and the revenue property, then a lot of the stuff in the product itself tends to be very, very straightforward. Quick break before we jump into the product here for Segment. The business model for the channel is very simple here. There's no ads, there's no monetization enabled for any of the videos. Instead, I work with a handful of companies every year to help them implement tools like Segment and really a complete stack of tools, which might include Mixpanel and Amplitude and so on. It can easily save you months and $20,000, $30,000 in wasted engineering costs and wasted costs if you choose the wrong tools. So if that sounds like you, check out rubenugarte.com/analytics, and you'll see everything you need to know about how these engagements work and how to get in touch if you're interested. If that's not you, no worries. I hope you enjoyed the video. A like and a comment is always appreciated. It helps the algorithm. It helps other people find the videos. So I'd love if you can do that. With all that being said, let's jump right into the demo. All right, so a lot of preamble. Now we're here. Now we can see the Segment demo. This is a pretty advanced Segment account. I will warn you. You can see there is, 10 sources. Actually, maybe more, maybe about 15 different sources and maybe 20, 30 destinations. So this account, of course, has been built over multiple years. This is not where you're going to be on day one. But it kind of gives you a sense. And I find this image in particular such a great overview of that core premise of Segment. You have a bunch of sources where data is coming from. You'll recognize some of them right away, right? We have Android data, iOS data, more Android, more iOS data. there's Ruby backend, there's a Shopify store, and there's JavaScript sources, the analytics.js that we saw before. And there's a bunch of destinations with Facebook and Google Analytics and Google Ads. There's AppsFlyer, there's Facebook, there's Amplitude, there's Mixpanel. There is a lot here. Now, this is the connections overview. There's a home overview that can show you other things. I just find this a good place to start. And let's jump in to the catalog once again. We saw this earlier today, but now we can sort of see it complete because this catalog actually will show all the sources and all the destinations in one place. That is, we can see, for example, when it comes to event streams, these are all the SDKs that Amplitude offers at the top. The JavaScript, the Ruby, the Java, and so on. And then you can actually get event streams from other places like Shopify. Shopify is kind of interesting. This is actually a plugin called Little Data that you add to your Shopify store, and it will generate a bunch of events out of your Shopify store out of the box. So things like the order completed, the product added to cart, the product clicked, and so on. I think it's maybe about 10 or 15 events that it generates. It will send them into Segment, and then from Segment, you can take them to a bunch of other places. So very helpful. There's some events you can get from Stripe, Salesforce, and then so forth, right? And then, of course, we saw our destinations itself. We know MailChimp, Braze, Klaviyo, and so on. So just a very cool place to see sources, to see destinations, to see everything in one place. Functions is also kind of cool. We're not going to see this here, but functions allow you to write what's effectively JavaScript and then kind of create your own integration of sorts. So if you have something that's custom, maybe you're taking things through like post webhooks or something like that, you can then write your own integration and send the data to Segment, and then it can flow to everywhere else you want to. So lots of flexibility how you get data into Segment if it's not pre-existent. I would say if you were to go with Segment and use this as your primary CDP, whenever you think of new tools, you need a new email marketing tool or you need a new A/B testing tool, typically this becomes your filtering process. So I find for clients who have Segment and they say, hey, we need an A/B testing tool, we then go to Segment and see, okay, what is supported inside Segment? We can see there's 5. These are the 5 options we're going to look at initially. And I just mentioned this because once you have Segment, add-in tools that are supported by Segment, it's really, really easy. If you have a tool that's not supported by Segment, for example, right now I was just doing some work with Microsoft Clarity, which is this heat mapping tool that's not supported by Segment. You have to go through this custom integration, and it just feels like a pain to have to go outside of the Segment.com ecosystem, especially when you have it. Especially you're paying for it. You've done all this work to build it up to make it really solid and reliable. Trying to do something outside the ecosystem feels painful. Now, just to know the Microsoft Clarity is actually being upvoted right now, so one day it will be there. But for now, it is not. So that's what's likely going to happen. Once you have this tool, you really make this your selection criteria for any other tools that get added, and it's going to make your life way easier. Trust me. Okay, so let's go into sources, and let's look at a few things. So let's look at just a random source like iOS. So we have the source, the overview. We're kind of seeing how many events are going through, some stats. If you go on debugger, this is actually real data that's coming in from the iOS app in this case. You can see that this is all coming in. So if we open something, I don't know, this is quite a bit. Maybe we'll pause it. This is already the track event, and it has the event name, the properties, and so on. And if you open the raw, you can see some just more data here. But this is typically what's being passed on in the code, and then Segment will then collect other properties behind the scenes for you. So it'll collect things like the time, of course, the timestamp, the device information. It will take the IP address and convert it into a city, a region, a country, and it will pass it on. Then in the schema, this is a reflection of effectively what the tracking plan is. So we can see all the data that's coming in. So there's an event called content started, and there's all this event properties being passed on to this event. And we can see that this is being passed on to 6 integrations. but we can decide that we may only want to send this event to one integration or a handful or nothing. We can then stop it altogether, of course. Keep in mind that this is a higher level custom plan for segment. I believe this is the business plan. So there's some features you might not see in lower level plans like specific integration destination. Nonetheless, we can see when the event was last sent, how many have been allowed over this time period of the past 7 days or the past 30 days. So you can see this is a lot really just about debugging. Is the data flowing in correctly? Are they flowing into the right integrations? Are the right event properties flowing in? This is really what segment is showing you here. And this is why, you're not really building reports here. That's happening somewhere else. You can have alerts for sources in case there's data issues. So you can be alerted of that. It kind of can compare numbers over time. And then, of course, there's some settings itself, but pretty basic, right? The work itself happens at the code level for tracking all those events that you saw in the schema, all the event properties. And the interface here is just simply showing us what the source is looking like, just at sort of a high level. How many events are passing on, how many errors, how many issues, that kind of stuff. Now down here, we can see all the integrations we're sending, whatever is enabled. Some stuff is disabled down here. If we open Amplitude, this is the Amplitude destination. This is an old Amplitude destination. This is what destinations used to look like in Segment for the most part. You still see them in some cases, but they were what we might call very basic. So you came in, you brought in your API key from Amplitude, you made some special settings, if you wanted to pass on page views or screens, any special traits, anything else that you want to change, right? That was sort of like a special option for the Amplitude destination. And again, you have to read the documentation to understand what all of this means. Or if you're familiar with Amplitude, you might recognize them. So they were effectively, the data would get ingested by the iOS source in this case, and then sent to Amplitude. And maybe it was tweaked through some of the settings, but generally, whatever you were sending to iOS, it was being sent to Amplitude for the most part, almost untouched. So think of this as like the V1 destination structure, the segment design when they first started. All the destinations were like that. Now, segment is actually moving into what they call the actions format. And we saw that before with the Mixpanel documentation. So let's actually look at a couple here. This one, actually. So this is the Amplitude destination for actions. The difference here is, just like before, we do start with some API keys and things like that. But actions has a concept called mappings. And mappings allows you to take the data you're ingesting and modify it in lots of different ways. There's a lot of flexibility here. So for example, if we open this mapping here, this mapping triggers by some logic. In this case, we're going to trigger with all track calls. And we're not going to do it for the events called order completed. Remember, this is a special event in segment. If we take a sample event, right, we see the kind of the structure we just saw earlier. And down here, we can map the fields from our ingested event into specific destination fields for Amplitude. So you can see here, these are dynamic, these little things here, but we can actually type actual text here as needed, right? So we have lots of flexibility here. If you remember before, we had some settings around like alias and things like that. Mapping allows us to create a very custom call or event structure that will be sent into Amplitude. So we can decide what's going to be the user ID, what will be the device ID, what's going to be the timestamp. For event properties, do we want to have any kind of logic or modification? Here's all this like the app version, device manufacturer, and so on and so on. We can add new fields if we wanted to. So there's lots of flexibility in the mappings, and it's very, very helpful because then you can do custom events, you can rename them, and so on. It's sort of the ultimate level of flexibility. If you wanted more flexibility in this, you would then have to manually integrate with Amplitude, where at the code level, you can do whatever you want. But barring that, this is sort of a lot of flexibility for how you send data into Amplitude. Now, when you create the mapping, Segment has actually created some pre-default mapping, so you actually don't have to do this from scratch. It may seem like it's a lot of work, but when you actually enable this destination, you'll have pre-created mappings with a lot of these fields already created for you. So you're not doing this from scratch, but you have the flexibility to change things if needed, if you have to. And then down here, you simply have a preview of everything you send it, and you can send a test event, and it will kind of tell you if this was handled successfully, right? I'm going to discard changes here. We're not going to save it. I actually have a good example here that I think will be worth seeing. We have some backend data here from a Ruby API. And for the Facebook Conversions API, which is also in Actions, we're then able to take some of this converted data and make sure we're passing it in the right format. Let's see if we can open this. So same thing, there's some things that Facebook expects to make these conversions work. So now we can send it all in just a single structure for segment, and then in the map, and we'll make sure that everything gets aligned properly to whatever Facebook expects. So what happens here is then we don't have to tweak the event to make it Facebook specific. We don't have to call the variable something that Facebook will recognize. We can instead call them whatever we want, and then we'll map them to whatever Facebook is expecting here specifically. So mapping is very helpful. I believe Amplitude is moving older destination to actions if possible. So you're likely going to see multiple destinations for some tools. Like Amplitude will have two. One is called the legacy, and one is called actions. Actions tends to be the most powerful option, of course. But that's a destination sentence. Again, you can see that there are some settings, there is some flexibility, but once again, the bulk of the sort of heavy lifting is already happening at the code level. This source, for example, this API source, is receiving data from the backend server, and every single data here is taken. It's all what's the word I'm gonna say? It's all being collected and populated at the backend level. So from there we can take this data and use it. A few other things. We look at the health. So health just simply shows you any errors for your sources. Very helpful, just as an overview of what might be going on. Some other things that we're not going to see but are available. Data privacy, just to help you manage data, especially if you have high data privacy requirements. You may be in an industry that has them, like healthcare, or perhaps in a region like Europe that may have them. Protocols, which you saw earlier, just data quality, being able to keep data consistent. If the names of events change for some reason, you can rename them to maintain everything and maintain some level of consistency among your data. Unify, which helps you combine multiple data sources into audiences. Again, you don't necessarily need this. Some of this work can be done at the destination level itself. So for example, Mixpanel can create audiences and then export those back into other places. Or perhaps you create audiences in Braze, and then again, send them back into Segment, and then Segment can send them elsewhere. So there's multiple options depending on what you want. But of course, if you do everything within the segment.com universe, you have this central place where everything is happening. And of course, Engage, just an addition from the Twilio acquisition. So that's really it. You can see that the Segment product is generally simple, might be the word that we're saying. It's very, very robust. It's very powerful, but it's really more about taking data from one place to another, making sure that things are collected correctly, and that you're passing them on to the right places. But you're not building dashboards, you're not building reports here, you're not doing any kind of data analysis. This is just making sure that all your data has been clean, renamed, and it's all going to flow as expected to Facebook and Google and Mixpanel and wherever else you need it to go. So as a summary, we looked at use cases, we looked at the pricing, we looked at the tracking plan. I think it's still a critical plan, even if you were to go through some kind of reverse ETL process. SDKs, we talked about that, some implementation best practices, and of course, we saw the demo of the product itself. And that is all I have for this video. So thank you, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this getting started with Segment, so you understand all the different pieces. It, of course, takes more than whatever this video is, 40, 50 minutes. It can take companies several weeks to create those tracking plan, identify the right SDKs, figure out where to put the code, the little snippets in your code, test things, make sure everything's flowing properly. But that's okay, right? This gives you an overview of what the plan might look like and what you can accomplish within, let's say, 2 or 4 weeks within your company. Now, a few final things before you go. Make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. If you are looking for help with your data, you can check out a link in the description, rubenyugarta.com/analytics. Then there is the track and plan Google Sheets in the description as well. You can just click that, make a copy to your own Google Drive. There's a book in the description, of course, called The Data Mirage, Why Companies Fail to Use Their Data. Check that out. That might be helpful as well. I hope you found this video helpful, and we will talk next week.